The people of Cold Creek, Montana Territory, had seen widows do strange things before, but nothing quite like what Linda Vasquez was doing that autumn of 1886. She was leading a 20-year-old ox along the trail behind her homestead, not to plow, not to haul, not to sell, simply leading him. And the animal himself wore a harness unlike any other in the valley, a leather rig studded with copper bells and small iron rings, some bright with polish, others darkened by years of weather. The rig had belonged to her husband Stephen, who had died 3 weeks earlier of a lung ailment nobody in the valley had been able to name. Stephen had never explained the harness. He had made it himself years before Linda married him, and though he had used it on the ox only rarely, he had kept it hanging on a peg inside the barn where it could not be missed. When Linda took it down and buckled it around old Rufus for the first time after Stephen's burial, the bells rang once softly and then went quiet again as if they too were mourning. Rufus was 20 years old. On the frontier, that was ancient for a working animal. His shoulders had thinned. His pace had slowed. Some mornings he moved as if the cold had settled into his joints during the night and refused to leave. Yet Linda walked him each day along the same path, down past the barn, along the creek line and back again, while the copper bells swayed against his ribs and made a low, uneven music that carried across the yard. That was what people found strange. Not the walking exactly. Widows did all kinds of unusual things in the weeks after a death. What people could not understand was why she was keeping the animal at all. By the end of the second week, the town butcher Larry Halstead decided to speak plainly. He arrived at the homestead on a Tuesday morning with his sleeves rolled up and a leather ledger tucked under his arm. Larry was not a cruel man. He had known Stephen for 11 years. He had extended credit to the Vasquez family more than once during hard winters. He believed he was doing Linda a kindness by saying what he came to say. 20 years old, he told her, standing beside the fence while Rufus grazed a few yards away. He's finished, Linda. Any teamster in this valley will tell you the same. Feed him another winter and you'll spend more on hay than the animal is worth. Linda listened without interrupting. She had learned that habit from Stephen. Let a man finish. Then decide. I can give you a fair price, Larry continued. Better than fair, enough for 2 months of provisions if you're careful. The hide alone would clear your account at the general store. No, the word arrived quietly. Larry paused, uncertain whether he had heard her correctly. He isn't for sale, Linda said. Not to you, not to anyone. Larry looked at the ox. He looked at the strange harness hanging on the fence rail behind her, its copper bells catching the pale October sun. Then he looked at Linda herself, standing in a black wool dress that had been mended twice at the elbow, a widow with no husband, no grown sons, and now, apparently, no sense. Linda, he said carefully, you can't afford sentiment, not this year. She did not answer. She simply reached for the bridle rope and led Rufus back toward the barn. The copper bells rang once against the iron rings as the ox turned. And though Larry Halstead did not know it that afternoon, though nobody in Cold Creek knew it yet, the sound those bells made would matter more, before winter ended, than every side of beef in his shop combined. The talk about the widow and her ox reached the trading post before the week was out. It reached the sawmill after that, then the church, then the small schoolhouse where the older children carried gossip home in place of arithmetic. Cold Creek was not a large settlement, 200 souls at most, scattered across a valley that ran east to west between 2 arms of the mountains. News moved through such a place the way water moved through a broken trough, slowly at first, then everywhere at once. Harold Finch, who ran the general store and held most of the winter credit accounts in his ledger, was the first to give the situation a name. The widow's pet, he called it, and the phrase caught. Within days, men who had never met Linda Vasquez were speaking of her animal as though it were a house cat kept for company. Some laughed. Others shook their heads. A few, who had lost husbands or wives themselves, said nothing and simply looked into their coffee. Walter Boone, the carpenter whose opinions carried weight throughout the valley, was blunter still. He had watched 3 winters break the Vasquez family already. Stephen's death, in his view, had been the 4th and final one. "A woman alone cannot afford an old ox," he told the men at the mill one afternoon. "She'll learn it. Winter teaches what husbands used to." The remark drew nods. Nobody argued. On the frontier, sentiment was a currency that spent quickly and returned nothing. An animal that could no longer pull a plow was an animal that ate hay for no reason, and hay in Montana territory cost more than most families cared to admit by the time March arrived. Linda heard the talk. The valley was too small for anything else. She heard it at the general store when she went to trade eggs for flour. She heard it at church on Sunday morning, when women greeted her too warmly and then looked away too quickly. She heard it in the silence of men who tipped their hats and said nothing at all. She did not defend herself. She did not explain. She simply kept walking Rufus each afternoon, and the copper bells kept ringing softly against the iron rings, and the ox kept following her at the same slow, patient pace he had kept for 20 years. Inside the cabin, the evenings had grown quiet in a way Linda had not yet learned to bear. Stephen's coat still hung behind the door. His rifle rested above the mantel where he had cleaned it the week before he took ill. His boots stood beside the wood box, the left one still scuffed from a broken plank he had meant to fix. Linda had not moved any of it. Some evenings she caught herself listening for footsteps that would not come. One night, after Rufus had been settled in the barn and the fire had burned down to embers, she took the harness from its peg and laid it across the kitchen table. She had never studied it closely, not the way Stephen had made it. Now in the yellow light of the oil lamp she looked at every detail. The copper bells were not bells exactly. They were small cups, hollow at the top, each one large enough to hold a thimble of oil. The iron rings that held them were thicker than they needed to be. Inside each ring, she saw, was a small wick channel blackened faintly by fire. The harness was not decoration. It was a lantern. 12 small lanterns, spaced along a rig meant for an ox. Linda sat still for a long time. Then very softly she said her husband's name aloud. Sleep did not come easily that night. Linda lay in the cold bed with the quilt pulled to her chin and stared at the ceiling boards, listening to the wind press against the north wall of the cabin. She had lived with Stephen for 11 years. She had watched him build fences, mend a wagon axle in the dark, break a colt without raising his voice. She had watched him make the harness itself, one long winter evening when Rufus was still young and the snow had been too deep for other work. She had asked him then what the copper cups were for. He had smiled without looking up from the leather. "For finding home," he said, nothing more. She had not pressed him. In those days, there had been time for questions later, and later had always seemed close at hand. Now later had arrived without him in it. Morning came pale and cold. Linda rose before the sun and went to the barn with a small tin of lantern oil she had traded eggs for at the general store. Rufus was already awake, standing in the straw as if he had been waiting. She rested her hand against his neck for a moment. His hide was warm beneath her palm, warmer than the air around them, and she felt for the first time in 3 weeks that she was not entirely alone in the world. She filled each copper cup carefully, 12 of them spaced along the harness at regular intervals. The oil was thick with cold and it took patience. When she was done, she buckled the rig around Rufus and stepped back to look at him. The bells did not ring. The oil had settled the small clappers inside each cup. What she saw instead was a working animal wearing 12 tiny lamps, unlit, waiting. She did not light them that morning. She simply led Rufus outside into the gray dawn and walked him along the same trail she had walked every day since Stephen's burial. Down past the barn, along the creek line, back again. The bells were silent now, weighted with oil, and the only sound was the slow, deliberate step of the ox behind her and the soft crunch of frost beneath her boots. Elias Crow, the sheep rancher whose property adjoined the Vasquez land to the north, saw her from across the fence line. He was breaking ice on his stock tank with the butt end of an axe. He paused, watched for a moment, then went back to his work. He had known Stephen well. He had helped carry the coffin. He did not laugh at the widow the way some men had, but he did not understand her either, and he had learned that the best thing a neighbor could offer sometimes was distance. That afternoon, Linda returned to the cabin and opened the small trunk at the foot of her bed. Inside were the few letters Stephen had kept from his years before their marriage. She had never read them. They had belonged to him, and she had respected that in life, and she had not disturbed them in death. Now she took them out one at a time and read them by the window in the thin gray light of early November. Most were from his mother, long dead. A few were from a brother in Kansas. And at the bottom, wrapped in a square of oilcloth, was a single letter written in a careful, unfamiliar hand. It was signed simply John, and it began, "Stephen, I am glad the ox arrived safe. Now I will tell you how to train him." Linda read the letter twice, then a third time more slowly, until the light in the window began to fade. The letter was 3 pages long, written in a hand that leaned slightly to the right, with occasional words crossed out and rewritten, as though the writer had been thinking carefully as he went. Linda read it a fourth time by lamplight after supper, and then she set it flat on the table and pressed her palms against it, as if the paper itself might tell her more than the words had. John, whoever he had been, wrote as a man teaches a friend. He explained that the ox had been born on a ranch outside Fort Worth, weaned late, and given to him as a yearling by a trail boss who had lost his voice to a cough and could no longer whistle commands. He explained that he had trained the animal himself over the course of 3 seasons on the Kishom Trail, moving longhorns north from Texas to Kansas, and that in those years he had discovered something about oxen that most white drovers he rode with never bothered to learn. An ox does not see the way we see, John had written. He does not follow a road because it is a road. He follows the ground under his feet, the wind against his side, the smell of water and smoke and old trails. He remembers what his mother taught him and what the herd taught him, and once he has walked a path in his mind, he will find it again even when the world above is changed. Linda read the sentence twice. "I taught this one to find home in white," John had continued. "When the storms came on the plains and the herd scattered, I would put him at the head and let him walk. He never lost the camp, not once in 3 years. I do not know how he does it. I only know that he does. If you train him further, be patient. Do not correct him when he seems to wander. He is not wandering. He is listening to something we cannot hear." The rest of the letter was practical. How to feed the animal in cold months. How to check his hooves for cracks. How to fit a harness so that the weight fell across his shoulders and not his neck. And at the end, almost as an afterthought, "The bells I sent along with him are meant to hold oil. You will see the use of it one day. A man cannot always carry a lantern in his hand." Linda sat for a long time with the letter open before her. Stephen had never mentioned John by name. He had spoken of his years driving cattle only rarely and always in fragments. She had known he had ridden with mixed outfits in his youth. She had not known that a black cowboy on the Kishom Trail had given him the animal that now stood in her barn. She folded the letter carefully and returned it to the oilcloth. Then she rose and went to the window. Beyond the glass, the yard was gray with early frost. The barn door was closed against the wind. Somewhere inside, Rufus was breathing slowly in his stall, 20 years old, patient, waiting for whatever came next, trained to find home in white. Linda repeated the words aloud, softly, testing them against the silence of the cabin. Stephen had said them to her once, years ago, casually, the way a man mentions a small thing he assumes his wife will remember. She had forgotten. She had let the sentence slip beneath 100 other sentences about fence posts and calving and the price of flour. Now the sentence had returned, and winter, she understood suddenly, was very close. The first snow arrived on the 9th of November, thin and dry, the kind of snow that skimmed the tops of the grasses without settling. It lasted a night and a morning and was gone by afternoon. But the wind that followed carried a different weight, and the men who read weather for a living began looking north more often than they spoke. Jeremiah Voss, the oldest trapper in the valley, stopped by the general store on the 12th of November with 2 mink pelts and a warning. He laid the pelts on the counter and told Harold Finch, without preamble, that he had seen elk moving down from the high country a full 3 weeks earlier than any year he could remember. He had seen grouse burrowing under fallen timber instead of roosting. He had seen his own dogs refusing to sleep outside. "Something is coming," he said. "Something big. Lay in more wood than you think you need. Harold Finch nodded politely and made a small notation in his ledger. He had heard old trappers predict apocalypse before. Most of their prophecies passed without incident. Still, that afternoon he ordered his eldest son to split another cord of pine behind the store, and he did not explain why. At the Vasquez homestead, Linda made her own preparations. She hauled water from the creek in double buckets and filled every barrel in the cabin. She stacked firewood along the north wall until the pile reached the eaves. She checked the seal around the door and stuffed fresh rags into the 2 window frames where the wood had shrunk during the summer. She counted her flour, her salt, her dried beans, and her coffee, and she wrote the numbers on a small piece of paper that she pinned to the wall beside the stove. Then she went to the barn. Rufus stood in his stall with his head lowered, chewing slowly at a wisp of hay. Linda ran her hand along his flank and felt the winter coat coming in thick beneath her palm. She refilled every copper cup on the harness with fresh oil. She trimmed each wick to the length John had described in his letter, no longer than a fingernail. She checked the leather at every buckle. She hung the harness on a peg beside the stall where she could reach it in the dark. She did not know yet what she was preparing for. She only knew that Stephen had left her one instruction, spoken casually years ago, and that the instruction had waited inside her memory like a seed under snow. Now the seed had cracked open, and she meant to be ready when it grew. The 18th of November brought the first true cold. The creek froze along its edges. The pump handle at the general store snapped at the joint and had to be replaced. Wagons that had rolled easily across the valley in October now cut deep grooves into the frozen mud, and the grooves stayed where they were made. Larry Halstead came by the homestead once more that week. He did not ask about the ox. He asked instead if Linda had enough wood, enough flour, enough coffee. He offered to bring her a side of venison from a deer he had shot the day before. Linda accepted and thanked him and did not mention Rufus. Larry did not either. They spoke for a few minutes about weather and about neighbors, and then he tipped his hat and rode away. That evening, standing at the window with the venison wrapped in cloth on the table behind her, Linda watched the sky darken over the northern ridge and felt the temperature fall through the glass. Something was coming. Jeremiah Voss had been right. The blizzard began on the 22nd of November, a Tuesday, in the middle of the afternoon. It did not arrive the way ordinary storms arrived. There was no slow build, no gathering of clouds along the ridge, no hour of thickening light before the first flakes fell. The sky simply changed. One moment the valley lay under a hard gray dome that seemed almost stationary. The next, the wind came down from the north like a hand sweeping a table clean, and the air filled with snow so dense that the fence beyond the barn disappeared inside a minute. Linda was at the woodpile when it began. She felt the temperature drop against her face before she understood what was happening, and by the time she reached the cabin door with an armload of pine, the world behind her had turned white. She stepped inside, barred the door, and stood for a moment with her back against the wood, listening to the wind find the corners of the roof. Within the hour, the storm had grown teeth. Snow drove sideways across the yard with a force that pressed against the north window like a hand. The stove pipe rattled. A loose board somewhere on the barn roof began to bang once every few seconds until finally it tore free and vanished into the whiteness with a sound like a shot. Linda fed the fire and sat close to it and did not sleep. By dawn on the 23rd, the yard was gone. Snow reached halfway up the north wall of the cabin. The barn was a pale gray shape at the far edge of visibility, and beyond it there was nothing at all. No fence, no creek, no road. The valley had been erased. Linda went to the barn twice that day, once at mid-morning and once at dusk, breaking a path through drifts that came to her waist. Rufus stood in his stall, calm, warm beneath his winter coat, eating slowly at the hay she had piled for him 3 days earlier. She rested her forehead against his shoulder each time before she left. His breath smelled of grass from a summer that felt now like something remembered from another life. The second day of the storm was worse than the first. The wind did not weaken. The snow did not slow. Linda kept the stove burning through the night and rationed her wood carefully, and still the north wall of the cabin grew cold to the touch by morning. She wrapped herself in Stephen's coat and sat close to the fire and waited for the storm to break. It did not break. By the afternoon of the 24th, she began to hear things beneath the wind. Sounds that might have been sounds and might have been imagination. A shout far off, a dog barking, the crack of timber. She could not tell what was real and what was the storm playing tricks on a mind that had gone too long without sleep. She stood at the window and saw only white. It was then that she remembered, not remembered exactly. The memory had been there all along, waiting. Stephen, 7 or 8 years earlier, standing in the doorway of the barn on a winter afternoon while snow fell steadily behind him. He had been brushing Rufus down after a long haul from the mill. He had turned to her and said, almost as a joke, "This one is trained to find home in white. John taught him. He does not lose his way in a storm." She had laughed. She had gone back to kneading bread. Now she stood at the window with her hand pressed flat against the cold glass, and she understood what he had meant. Linda did not act at once. What she was considering was not the kind of thing a person did without weighing it first, and she waited standing at the window with her palms still pressed against the glass and the wind still hammering at the north wall behind her. Between her cabin and the general store lay 2 miles of open country. In fair weather, a walk of 40 minutes. In this storm, it was not a distance at all. It was a direction, and directions had ceased to exist in the valley the moment the first snow began to fall. A man could walk in a circle for hours in a whiteout and freeze within sight of his own door. Every rancher in Cold Creek knew the story of the Nielsen boy who had been found the previous spring, curled beneath a sagebrush 50 yards from his father's barn. But she had heard something. She was almost certain of it, a shout faint from the direction of the store, and she had heard earlier that morning the distant crack of what might have been a rifle. Someone was out there, perhaps more than one. She thought of the mill hands who lived in the small bunkhouse behind the sawmill. She thought of Amos Weller, the widower who kept the general store and slept in a room above it. She thought of the 3 men she had seen at the store the previous week, arguing about the price of nails. Then she thought of Rufus. She put on Stephen's wool coat over her own. She wrapped her head and neck in a heavy scarf and pulled a knitted cap down over her ears. She fitted her hands into the thick mittens Stephen had worn for winter hauling, and over those she pulled a second pair made of oiled leather that reached to her elbows. She filled a small canvas sack with strips of dried venison and a tin flask of coffee she kept warm on the back of the stove. She took a box of lucifer matches from the shelf above the sink and wrapped them twice in oilcloth. Then she went to the barn. Rufus watched her come in with the same steady patience he had shown for 20 years. She lit the small lantern that hung by the door and set it on a hook where it would not disturb him. She lifted the harness from its peg and carried it to his stall. The copper cups were still full of oil. The wicks were still trimmed to a fingernail's length. She buckled the rig around him one strap at a time, checking each seam, testing each ring, as though her husband himself were watching her from somewhere just outside the light. When the harness was on, she stood at Rufus's head and looked into his eye. He looked back at her without moving. The whites were calm. His breath was slow and warm. "You know the way," she said quietly. "He told me you did." She struck a lucifer against the doorframe and cupped the small flame in her palm. Then she moved along the harness, cup by cup, touching the flame to each wick until all 12 of them caught. The oil burned yellow at first, then settled into a steady blue-tipped flame that swayed gently with the ox's breathing. The bells did not ring. The oil held the clappers still. Rufus wore 12 small lanterns now, spaced along his back and sides, and in the gloom of the barn he looked less like an animal than like some slow, patient constellation waiting to walk out into the storm. Linda took the lead rope in her hand. "All right," she said. "Take us home in white." She opened the barn door. The wind struck them both at once. Linda felt it drive through the wool of Stephen's coat as though the coat were not there, and she felt Rufus flinch beside her, not from fear but from the shock of the cold against his face. She did not pull him forward. She simply let the rope hang loose between them and waited. For a long moment the ox stood in the open doorway of the barn with the storm ahead of him and did not move. His head lowered slightly. His nostrils widened. The 12 small flames along his back guttered once in the wind and then steadied, sheltered by the copper cups that held them. Linda watched him and said nothing. Then Rufus took a step forward, not toward the road, not toward the fence line. He turned his shoulders slightly to the left of where Linda would have gone herself, and he began to walk into the whiteness at a slow, even pace, as though he were following a trail that only he could see. Linda followed. She kept the rope loose in her hand. She remembered what John had written. Do not correct him when he seems to wander. He is not wandering. He is listening to something we cannot hear. She let Rufus set the pace and set the direction, and she walked in the small pocket of shelter his body made against the wind, with the copper lanterns burning yellow above her. The storm closed around them within 20 paces. The barn disappeared behind. The cabin, off to her right somewhere, was already gone. There was only the ox, the wind, and the 12 small flames. She could not tell how long they walked. Time in a blizzard did not behave the way time behaved indoors. Her feet grew numb inside her boots, then burned, then grew numb again. Her breath froze on the scarf across her mouth. Once she stumbled into a drift that came to her thigh, and Rufus stopped and waited until she pulled herself free before he began to walk again. He did not hesitate. He did not circle. He walked in a line as straight as a plumb line, adjusting his angle now and then by a hand's breadth, as though correcting for something in the wind or the ground beneath his hooves. Linda watched his shoulders move ahead of her through the snow and thought of John, whoever he had been, teaching this animal on the plains of Kansas 20 years earlier. She thought of Stephen, receiving him as a young ox and asking in careful letters how to keep what John had taught him alive. She thought of her husband making the harness one winter, alone in the barn, cutting the leather and shaping the copper cups by lamplight, and never quite explaining what any of it was for. She understood now that he had been building this exact moment. A widow walking behind a lantern-lit ox through a blizzard that had erased the world. The general store came out of the whiteness so suddenly that Linda nearly walked into the wall of it. One moment there was only snow. The next, a dark shape rose in front of them, low and long, and she saw the outline of the porch roof and the small square of the window beside the door. Rufus stopped. He did not need to be told. He stood with his head lowered and his flanks steaming, and the 12 small lanterns burned steadily around him. Linda pressed her hand against his neck for a moment. Then she moved past him to the door of the store and began to pound on the wood with the side of her fist. "Amos," she called into the wind. "Amos Weller, anyone." She heard nothing at first. Only the wind driving snow against the plank wall of the store and past her into the whiteness beyond. She pounded again, harder this time, using the flat of her palm because her knuckles no longer had feeling in them. "Amos." "It's Linda Vasquez. Open the door." Something shifted inside. A muffled voice. Then a scrape of wood on wood, and the door gave way inward against her weight. Linda half fell across the threshold, dragging cold air and snow with her, and Amos Weller caught her by the elbow and pulled her inside. He was a thin man in his 60s, gray-bearded, wearing 3 coats one over the other and a wool cap pulled low over his ears. His face was gaunt in the lamplight. Behind him the store was dim and bitterly cold. The stove in the corner had gone out. "How?" he said, staring past her at the doorway. "How did you get here?" Linda turned. Beyond the door, Rufus stood patient in the storm, the 12 small flames still burning along his sides. Amos took a step back from what he saw and then another. "I'll explain," Linda said. "Are you alone?" Amos shook his head slowly. "Cellar," he said. "Nielsen and his boy came in yesterday afternoon before the worst of it, then Larry Halstead. He was headed home from delivering meat to the bunkhouse and could not find the road. We've been down there since, trying to keep out of the wind. The stove burned through the wood before dawn." Linda felt something ease in her chest that she had not known was tight. "How many?" "4 of us counting me. Nielsen, the boy, Halstead, and myself." "Get them up, all of them, warm as you can. I'm taking you home one at a time." Amos looked at her. He looked at the ox behind her. He looked at the copper cups burning steadily against the wind, and for a moment his mouth worked without producing any sound. "Linda," he said finally, "that is 2 miles in this." "I know how far it is." Rufus knows the way, get them up." He did not argue further. She heard him call down through the trapdoor in the floor, and after a moment she heard boots on the cellar ladder and low voices, hoarse from cold and thirst. The Nielsen boy came up first, no more than 12 years old, blue about the mouth. His father followed, holding the boy's shoulders. Then Larry Halstead, moving stiffly, his beard crusted with frost. Larry saw her and stopped where he stood. He looked at her face. He looked past her at the doorway where Rufus waited in the storm with the 12 small lanterns burning. He did not speak. Whatever he had once said to her about that animal, he did not say now, and Linda saw in his eyes that he understood he was not going to. "The boy first," she said to Amos. "He's coldest." She wrapped the Nielsen boy in her own scarf and in a horse blanket Amos brought from behind the counter. She lifted him herself onto Rufus's back in front of the harness, where the ox's own warmth would rise into him. She told him to hold to the leather at the withers and not to let go for anything. Then she took the lead rope again and turned Rufus into the storm. He walked the same line back, not the line Linda would have chosen, his own line. The wind struck them from a different angle now, and the snow drove harder, but the ox did not falter, and the 12 small flames burned steadily above the boy's bent head as they moved together into the white. She made the walk 4 times that day and into the night. The boy first, then Nielsen, then Amos Weller, then last Larry Halstead, who was the heaviest and the slowest to warm, and who rode the 2 miles home behind her without speaking a single word. Each time, Rufus walked the same line. Each time, the storm tried to turn him and failed. By the 4th crossing, the copper cups had burned low, and Linda refilled them in the barn with fingers that no longer bent at the knuckles, and lit them again, and went back out. When she brought Larry through her cabin door and lowered him into a chair beside her stove, the sky over the northern ridge was beginning to pale. The blizzard broke on the morning of the 26th. Cold Creek dug itself out slowly. The mill was buried to the eaves. The general store had lost part of its porch roof. 2 horses had died in a collapsed shed at the Nielsen place. But no person in the valley had been lost, and by the time the news traveled from cabin to cabin, everyone knew why. Larry Halstead came to the Vasquez homestead a week later. He came on foot because the roads were still not fit for a wagon, and he came without his ledger. He stood in Linda's kitchen with his hat in his hands and told her that every side of beef in his shop was hers for the coming year, and that he would deliver it himself, and that she was not to speak a word against it. Linda listened until he was finished. Then she said, "I don't want the beef." Larry looked at her. "I want you to teach the town," she said. "The way Stephen trained Rufus. The way John taught Stephen. If we had known before this winter, we would not have needed lanterns on an ox. We would have had a dozen animals in this valley that could find home in white. I want you to learn it, Larry, and I want you to teach it. That is what I want." Larry stood for a long moment with his hat in his hands. Then he nodded once slowly and said that he would. The letter Linda wrote that spring was carried east by a mail rider and then by rail, and it reached a small farm outside of Abilene, Kansas, in the middle of April. It was addressed to a woman named Sarah, the widow of John, who had ridden the Kisham Trail with the drovers 30 years earlier, and had given a yearling ox to a young cowboy named Stephen Vasquez before either of them ever thought of Montana. Sarah came in June. She was a small woman with steady hands and eyes that had seen a great deal. She stayed at the Vasquez homestead for the summer. She walked with Linda in the mornings and taught her what John had taught Stephen, and what Stephen, for reasons of his own, had never quite gotten around to explaining. She met Rufus. She rested her palm against his neck and stood with him a long time in the pasture without saying anything at all. By the following winter, 6 oxen in Cold Creek had begun the training. By the winter after that, 12. The copper cups on Rufus's harness were oiled once more and hung in the barn where they could not be missed, and Linda took them down only rarely, because she no longer needed to. Some knowledge she had learned was meant to be given away, and some widows kept old animals because their husbands, before dying, had left them the one thing worth keeping.